Okay. So Robert E. Lee actually lived in a house overlooking Washington, D.C. If you visit Washington, D.C. today, the Custis Lee Mansion is on a high hill overlooking Washington. It's inside Arlington National Cemetery, and you can see it from anywhere inside D.C. It's really kind of cool. You can tour it if you go to the Arlington National Cemetery. You can actually go inside and you can see the house where Robert E. Lee lived and where he stayed up all night long the night that Abraham Lincoln invited him to the White House and asked him to be the lead general for the North. So if you can imagine this, Robert E. Lee's got an invitation to be the leading Northern general. Well, in the end, he said to President Lincoln, he said, I can never imagine going to war against the state of Virginia. That's my home state, and that would be my family. So he turned it down, resigned from the Union Army, and soon was made a general in the Southern or Confederate Army. After a year or so in which he was working kind of behind the scenes, he was promoted to be the head general of the Confederate Army by the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis. Now, for the next several years, the war would rage, and the Northern Army changed leaders after just about every major battle. Abraham Lincoln would get really upset and would fire the general because they almost always lost. In fact, Robert E. Lee, for the first several years that he was leading the Southern Army, never lost a major battle, not one. So Abraham Lincoln would promote somebody, George C. McClellan or General Hooker, General Burnside, General Gordon C. Meade. He went through several of them, and they would fight. They'd fight a war, and they would lose to Robert E. Lee's army, and Abraham Lincoln would fire them and promote somebody else. Meantime, the Southerners stuck with Robert E. Lee. All of this fighting was done really close to Washington, D.C. It was in the east. There were other battles taking place in the west near the Mississippi River, but the biggest armies for both the North and the South were really kind of congregating right around Washington, D.C. And in fact, most of the major battles in the United States, war between the states, were fought right there within easy reach of Washington. Manassas Junction, even the Gettysburg campaign was kind of centered around Washington, D.C., and I'll explain that in just a minute. So who was Robert E. Lee? Well, he was well educated. He was from a wealthy family. He went to West Point. He fought in the Mexican-American War and even met Ulysses S. Grant during the Mexican-American War, which was fought in the late 1840s, so about 20 years before the Civil War broke out. And the two of them, Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee, were both very young men, and they fought close to each other and remembered each other, and were able to talk about that later on. Robert E. Lee was beloved of his men. They really thought highly of him, and despite the fact that he was on the wrong side of the war, on the side that supported slavery, he was someone who really stood up for his faith. And in fact, he and his right-hand general, a man by the name of General Stonewall Jackson, were convinced that the soldiers should be in church as often as possible. So General Stonewall Jackson would actually preach to the soldiers. He was a gifted general in his own right. He was kind of the assistant to Robert E. Lee, but he would preach sermons to his soldiers and have altar calls and that sort of thing. The two of them worked very well together. I mentioned that Robert E. Lee went several years and he never lost a major battle. That was the whole time that he and Stonewall Jackson were working together. While the two of them were working together, Robert E. Lee never lost a single battle. But after General Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own soldiers, he had gone out, he wanted to kind of see what the battlefield looked like for himself. He was kind of spying out the land before the battle was going to start. Anyhow, on his way back, he was shot accidentally by his own soldiers who thought he was, an enemy coming. So after the death of General Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee never won a major battle again. I mentioned how most of the war took place, there close to Washington, D.C. It was always in the southern states. At the end of the war, when things were kind of falling apart for the South, the northern armies would march through the South and would destroy cities and burn homes and schools and churches and government buildings and whatever. They really were trying to force the Southerners to stop fighting, just stop fighting. But almost all of the war then took place inside the southern states. Well, Robert E. Lee got the idea, if we're ever going to win this war, then we have to fight battles inside the North, because if the Northerners feel what it's like to have an army invade their states, they're going to want this war to end, and they're going to want it to end right now. The South didn't have to defeat the North. All they had to do was to fight long enough for the North to get tired of fighting, to say, no, we don't want to do this. The South wasn't trying to defeat the North. They just wanted the North to leave them alone. And so Robert E. Lee took all of his army, the best that he could, amassed them all, and began to march north. He went into Maryland and then into Pennsylvania. And if you look at the map, it's obvious he was marching his army around Washington, D.C. That's because the principal army of the North was between him and Washington. The North knew that if Robert E. Lee could capture Washington, D.C., that the war would probably come to an end pretty quickly. So they kind of wheel around each other, which is really kind of odd, because after just a few days of marching, it put Robert E. Lee more north than the Northern Army. And so beginning in July 1st of 1863 and lasting to July 3rd, so 3 days, the first 3 days of July in 1863, in a little town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the Army of the North, which was led by Gordon C. Meade, and the Army of the South, which was led by Robert E. Lee, would have a massive fight. And there were several mistakes that Robert E. Lee's generals made. Really, probably it was God kind of confusing them, because the South probably, if they'd won that battle, they probably would have won the war. There'd have been no keeping them away from New York City. They'd have had an easy march right into New York City, and that would have probably ended the war right then and there. So God had a plan in all of it. But the battle lasted for 3 days. There was tremendous fighting, but the North had kind of entrenched themselves on the higher ground. So they were up on hills. There was a Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge, and you can still visit Gettysburg today, and it's a pretty awesome place to visit when you consider what happened there and all the lives that were lost there. But North and South fighting against each other, and the South lost. Robert E. Lee and his armies were defeated at Gettysburg. And so he turned around and began to retreat back into the South. General Gordon C. Meade, who was the first Northern general to ever defeat Robert E. Lee, was still fired by Abraham Lincoln because Abraham Lincoln wanted him to chase Robert E. Lee back into Virginia. But the battle had been so devastating for everybody, and so many people had been killed and wounded. Gordon C. Meade said, "We're too weak to give chase. We can't do that right now." Of course, famously, President Lincoln showed up at the battlefield shortly afterwards and gave his famous Gettysburg Address, which is probably one of the most beautiful speeches given in American history. Well, when Ulysses S. Grant was finally promoted to lead the main Army of the North after Gettysburg when General Meade was fired. Ulysses S. Grant, who had been fighting out around the Mississippi, well, he was given the opportunity to lead the North. Well, by this time, the South had been beaten up pretty badly. They were pretty weakened. They were out of food. They were out of ammunition. And so it took a long time. It took nearly a year of some of the most miserable fighting in American history. And it was just grinded out day by day, inch by inch. But it became evident that the South had no way to win. It was time to give up. And so Robert E. Lee met General Ulysses S. Grant at the McLean House in Virginia. This was a little community called Appomattox, and Robert E. Lee came and surrendered to General Grant. And for all intents and purposes, this ended the Civil War. General Grant was very friendly to Robert E. Lee, and this kind of set the tone for some interesting things that happened afterwards. For example, General Grant did not take the horses from the Southern soldiers. He said these Southern soldiers are going to need their horses when they get home to their farms. So as long as they gave up their weapons and just turned around and marched home, then that was enough. He didn't imprison them. He just said, you have to stop fighting, you have to give up your weapons, and you have to go home. And so that was probably one of the more loving or kind or graceful ways that any war has ever come to an end. Robert E. Lee would retire and would become the president of a university. It's now called Washington and Lee University. In those days, it was just called Washington University. He was so respected and admired by both Northern and Southern soldiers, which is really kind of hard to imagine, especially the way that we view politics and history today, that when he died, he was actually mourned by the North and the South. That's kind of hard to imagine, isn't it? I'll tell you something even more surprising. When the war was over, in 1868, so the next election after the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president, and he ran for re-election in 1872. The New York Herald, so this is New York is in the North. A northern newspaper, the New York Herald, said in a front page editorial, a letter to the Democrat Party, because Ulysses S. Grant was a Republican. The New York Herald said to the Democrats, you ought to nominate Robert E. Lee to run for president of the United States. So I mention that because it's hard to imagine today how highly he was respected even by the people he was fighting against. And they trusted him as a gentleman. They knew that even the North knew that he was not fighting to make himself wealthy or famous or anything like that. So something to think about. One of those American families, his family was so closely associated with our own war for independence. And Robert E. Lee was, despite the fact that he was a Southerner who left the United States, was always very proud to call himself an American. And in fact, I'll leave one last story with you to kind of explain. It was just a different world in those days. As they were marching through Pennsylvania on their way to what would become the Gettysburg Battle, there was a teenage girl who came out on the front porch, and she was very defiant. She was a Northern girl, very defiant, and she had an American flag, and she waved the American flag at the Southern soldiers, and she said, I can't believe that you all would fight against this American flag, but this is the only flag that I love. Of course, the Southerners had their own flag. It was red, white, and blue, but it wasn't the American flag. And the army was stopped, and one of Robert E. Lee's generals, a fellow by the name of General Pritchard, shouted to his troops, he said, "Why don't you show this young lady what you think of the American flag?" And they cheered and they waved their hats for the American flag. Even though they were fighting against the Union, they still consider themselves Americans. And I think that kind of summarizes Robert E. Lee and his attitude toward the war. Of course, we know that God had a plan, and it was not God's plan that there would be slaves or slavery in America. And that question was forever settled because of the end of the Civil War. It's a very confusing, very complex issue, isn't it? Still a lot of things that we talk about today, even though the war was over 150 years ago. It's still very, especially in communities where the fighting took place and such. It's still an issue that's very delicate today, and people's emotions really get touched by it. So just something to think of. God bless you in your study of United States history. It's important for us to understand our past so that we understand how we got where we are today. And so I encourage you to be good students, and praying for you every day, and look forward to seeing your faces again sometime soon.